He has been called a legend here at Toronto Police Headquarters, the type of detective every investigator should be. You may not know his name, but he's worked on some of the most horrific murders this city has ever seen. Gary Giroux is retiring after almost 40 years on the job. And tonight throughout our show, he's going to walk me through the unsolved case that still haunts him and tell me about one of the many victims he will never forget. We're going to start now with her murder.
Cabbagetown, 2012. 55-year-old Nigisti Semret was repeatedly stabbed to death walking home after her overnight shift at the Delta Chelsea Hotel.
It's a sad story. I never hear like this. I never see like this.
Her murderer was caught on security cameras following her, a shadowy, deadly presence. A good Samaritan tried to intervene, but the attacker made off. Semret was just around the corner from her home. Her death horrified the community.
It's very disturbing to think that there is some psycho roaming around somewhere.
While the motive for her killing remained a mystery.
The motive for the attack on Miss Semret still remains unclear.
People came and laid all kinds of flowers and they had pictures.
7 years later, Gary Giroux returns to the scene of where she died.
She comes right through the laneway, like right over to Bleecker, and she's picked up on the cameras.
Giroux believes Semret's murderer was waiting for her and must have known what route she took home. So she really fought him, didn't she?
She did, to the point where she cut him, scratched him.
And that is how Semret herself helped the detective solve her own murder. More than 7 months after she died, police were able to find her killer. His DNA, which was under her fingernails, was found at another murder scene.
It wasn't until Regat Girmay's murder took place, which was the offender's girlfriend, and I got a call from the biologist. Her voice was shaking, and she indicated to me that we have a DNA hit from scene to scene, and the offender for Regat Girmay's case was already in custody, so we knew who it was.
You can tell him that I'm investigating the murder of Nigisti Semret.
Giroux solved the who, but never the why.
Up until that moment, did you have any idea who killed Ms. Semret and why?
None. And I still don't definitively know why. I knew from checking backgrounds that they were from the same Eritrean village, and they spent some time in a transition house here where new immigrants arrived.
Earlier when we were talking and you mentioned her and her life and how she came here, it sounded to me like you actually liked her.
I did, because like in all cases, you research the victim and you get to know them. She came here with very little, to make a better life for herself. She wanted you to work hard at the hotel, and when I heard about her injuries and the fact that she clearly fought this guy, it didn't surprise me at all. It was almost something that I completely expected her to do.
Nigisti Semret isn't the only murder victim Giroux will never forget. There are so many more.
George Faywell was another one that stood out in my mind. He was found behind Jimmy Simpson Arena there on the railroad tracks, and he was developmentally delayed. He had a learning disability. He was a really frail, easily victimized individual.
And then there is 11-year-old Ephraim Brown, who should now be 23 years old.
He was allowed to stay up late,
at a party,
for a party in the community.
Beautiful summer night.
And two gangs came to the party together and ended up shooting at each other, and the young boy was in between. And that one, I hear from his mom on occasion, and Ephraim's sister. Yeah.
And coming up, one of the unsolved murder cases that still haunts Gary Giroux, and I ask him how he stays grounded after such a difficult job. He has solved some of the city's toughest murders, but there is one that still haunts him, and years later, he wants to know who did it and why. Detective Gary Giroux is retiring after almost 40 years on the job. He's considered a legend here at Toronto Police Headquarters, and tonight he takes me to the scene where 2 young men were murdered. It's a place he returns to regularly.
June 13th, 2008.
I'll always be trapped in that car. I can't get beyond.
This picture was taken of 25-year-old Oliver Martin and 26-year-old Dylan Ellis. 3 minutes later, they were dead, shot to death point blank in Ellis's parents' black Range Rover on Richmond near Bathurst. Martin's girlfriend, who took the photo, was in the back seat but was not injured. They had spent the night watching the NBA playoff finals at a friend's condo and were on their way home, but came back because they had forgotten to return their friend's keys. They were killed just as they pulled up.
I think it's a possibility that there'd been some perceived disrespect.
The area has changed a lot in 10 years, but Detective Giroux remembers exactly what happened.
Dylan Ellis has the window down because it's warm out, and he turns his head to the left and says something to the effect of, like, "How's it going?" And then there's just a series of shots fired.
All these years later, there is still no suspect and no motive. And Gary Giroux still comes back and sits in the parking lot across the street, wondering if there is something he missed.
I sit just to see if there's any inspiration, you know. I've done that on a few, you know, and I'm not saying it's like overly remarkable, but this one bothers me. That's why it was towards the top of the list. I like to see it solved, even if the offender ends up being deceased himself or whatever it happens to be. But these guys were going to go on to, you know, do great stuff, you know.
So what do you think happened? Were these young men in the wrong place at the wrong time? Did they anger somebody?
We looked at, you know, could it have been like a road rage where the offender had the ability to follow them back? Could it be, you know, a case of mistaken identity in relation to a very unique looking high-end, you know, motor vehicle? I don't think I can remember ever having one in 22 years where there was just nothing based on the deceased's lifestyle that didn't give me some investigative direction.
Giroux estimates he's investigated some 200 murders in the 22 years he's been in homicide. He started as a cop right out of high school. He knew when he was 14, that's what he wanted to do.
Do you still keep in touch with family members of these two young men who were murdered here?
I haven't spoken to them in some time, but I have one mom that I hear from probably every month since 2003.
Wow.
Yeah.
And is that unsolved or solved?
No, solved. Yeah, solved.
Really?
Yeah. And to the point now where the gag around the office is that I've been there so long that people who have served like life sentences are now getting out.
You see the worst of the worst. You go to these grim crime scenes.
Yeah.
How do you compartmentalize all of that? How do you not let it all absorb into you?
The longevity key is family support. No question. That's number one. And then staying focused, staying professional. But if you don't have that pillar at home, then you're going to be lost very quickly, because it's dark.
Gary Giroux credits his wife for keeping him grounded. Now, he says he's going to need to keep busy. He might do some consulting in the future, but he promises he's not going to write a book. But to give you a sense of just how respected Gary Giroux is here at Toronto Police Headquarters, I reached out to Hank Itzinga, who's another homicide officer. He's actually investigating the alleged serial killer Bruce McArthur case. And this is what he wrote me back. And he said, "Gary is indeed a legend and the type of detective every investigator should aspire to be. Infamous for working 36, 48-hour days, never a glory seeker, loved by Crown attorneys and judges. If there was a handbook or course out there titled How to Be a Homicide Detective, they might as well call it How to Be Gary Giroux." And coming up, I have one more story from Gary Giroux. This one is about how he ended up investigating then Toronto Mayor Rob Ford amidst the crack cocaine scandal. I've been telling you tonight about how a legend here at Toronto Police Headquarters is retiring after almost 40 years on the job. Detective Gary Giroux has investigated some 200 homicides in this city, but one of the most interesting, high-profile investigations he's ever done was when he had to investigate then Toronto Mayor Rob Ford during the height of the crack cocaine scandal. Tonight he opens up to me about just what that was like.
No, come on.
2013, Detective Gary Giroux was called on to investigate Rob Ford.
Those were crazy times.
They were. Yeah, they were.
After the infamous crack cocaine video was recovered by police during raids. They were dubbed Project Traveler, and they were on a street gang called the Dixon City Bloods.
You were investigating the mayor of the city of Toronto.
Right.
And
Yeah.
what was that like?
Well, It came about, as you know, from Project Traveler, and you know, I spoke to my wife about it the other day because I kind of figured that, you know, the former mayor would come up, and there were these intercepts during Traveler that the chief, who at the time was Bill Blair, said that I think at some point in time, as a result of the transparency of the disclosure, somebody is going to say to me, what did you do about a sitting mayor who was very comfortable in the presence of organized crime, a criminal street gang, and appeared to be consuming narcotics, and that there was a video out there, and what did you, as the chief of police, do about it? And he says, you're the one that's going to do something about it.
So you investigated exactly what?
Well, the mandate was to determine whether there was any criminality in relation to the mayor or the office of the mayor. And so we started to interview staff members and former staff members and conduct surveillance. It went on for a long time.
Was there a plane following?
There was planes, and we had a dedicated surveillance team.
What was your conclusion?
Well, my conclusion was that the mayor at the time was consorting with known active criminals, and these were people who were identified during Traveler as being violent members of the community who had victimized many people violently, sold firearms, sold drugs. As far as ever getting to the point where the mayor was like arrestable for anything, I never found that there was anything that was you know, suitable or appropriate, you know, for the mayor to be arrested for.
All these years later, was it the right thing to do to investigate him and have all those hours of surveillance?
You know, I stand behind it, and I do agree with the chief that at some point in time, somebody, and I suspect it would have come from the media, would have said, why didn't you do something about that? And I sat in his office on many occasions, you know, more than I ever have for any other chief over the years, and we had these types of discussions, and he basically said, what am I supposed to do as the chief?
And ultimately, in a sense, you cleared then Mayor Rob Ford.
Yeah, in a sense. I mean, I don't agree with his conduct, you know, in relation to, you know, the people that he found himself in the presence of, because they were dangerous North End Dixon gang members, and I think his conduct was wrong. But as far as any criminality, it wasn't appropriate to go in that direction.
Detective Gary Giroux also investigated the G20 protests, with hundreds of charges being laid and a 98% conviction rate. He says he's going to miss the people here. I'm pretty sure they're going to miss him back.